The man stared at the laptop screen, his hand trembling. His lips parted, breath caught halfway in his throat. What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the cold, sterile room. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and replayed the footage. Again. His son, his only son, was sitting up. But that wasn't the shock. No, it was the way his son, who had been bedridden for weeks, barely able to speak, was now alive. Alive in a way no one had ever seen. He was smiling. Not a weak twitch of the lips. Not a strained, exhausted attempt at a smile. No. It was a full, radiant grin. His son's eyes sparkled, there was life in them again. But that wasn't all. He was laughing. A sound that hadn't been heard in months. A sound the man had almost forgotten. His son laughed as though nothing was wrong. As though there had never been sickness. As though he hadn't been fading away day by day. And he wasn't alone. The nurse, the gypsy woman he had hired, the strange young woman with eyes like a storm, was sitting beside him. She whispered something in his ear. Something incomprehensible. The words weren't familiar. They weren't even a language he recognized. But there was a rhythm to it. A chant, almost. Something that drew his son from the depths of despair and into the light of a miracle. The man could feel the air in the room shift as he watched them. It felt wrong. Out of place. And yet, it felt like the answer to everything he had been searching for. He leaned closer to the screen. Eyes widening in disbelief. The nurse held up a small red thread in her hand. She tied it around his son's wrist with fingers that moved as though they knew something he didn't. As though she had a knowledge, a power, that no doctor, no medical expert, could ever offer. His chest tightened. His mind screamed at him to stop watching. To look away. To reject it all. But he couldn't. There was something about the nurse's presence. Something magnetic, almost as if she had control over his son. As if she were doing more than just caring for him. As if she were performing some kind of ritual. Then, for just a second, she looked directly into the camera. Her eyes weren't just looking at him. They were looking through him. Her gaze was intense. Calculating. As if she knew exactly who was watching. A small, knowing smile curved her lips. The man's breath caught. And that's when it happened. His son, his fading boy, spoke. One word. Soft. Almost a whisper. But heavy. So heavy. Anna. The nurse's eyes flickered. She paused. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she whispered back, "Yes, child. Soon." The man froze. His body stiffened. Everything in the room seemed to stop. Who was Anna? And why had his son, who hadn't spoken in months, just said that name? The answer wasn't in any medical book. It wasn't something he could Google. It wasn't even something science could explain. It was something else. Something old. Something beyond his understanding. And then, the man realized something that chilled him to the bone. Whatever had taken hold of his son, it wasn't just a miracle. It was something far darker. Something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. He hit the pause button. His heart hammered in his chest. He didn't want to believe what he had just seen, but the evidence was right there. In the flickering image of his son, alive again. He sat back, staring at the screen. What had he done? What had he invited into his home? He had hired the nurse to save his son. To give him a fighting chance. But now he wondered if he had unknowingly invited something far worse. Something dangerous. Something magical. And as he looked back at the footage, a deep feeling of dread settled in his chest. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. 3 weeks earlier, Richard Donovan, the billionaire shipping magnate, was desperate. His only son, 10-year-old Henry, was slowly fading away before his very eyes. A rare degenerative illness had taken hold of the boy, leaving him barely able to speak, barely able to move. The best doctors had shaken their heads in defeat, offering nothing but empty words of sympathy. Henry, once a lively child, was now a shell of himself, trapped in a body that refused to cooperate. Richard had tried everything. Modern medicine, experimental treatments, even alternative therapies. Nothing worked. Nothing reached his son. That's when a colleague, an old friend, of sorts, whispered a strange suggestion to him in a dimly lit corner of the office one afternoon. Hire someone, unconventional, the friend said, his voice low, like he was revealing a forbidden secret. Someone who believes in healing beyond hospitals. The words didn't make sense to Richard at first. But desperation clouds even the sharpest minds. When you've run out of options, you're willing to try anything. And that's how Mirella came into their lives. A young gypsy woman, barefoot, cloaked in vibrant colors, her eyes burning with the intensity of ancient fire. She said little but had a presence that was impossible to ignore. Her gaze was deep, like she could see into your soul. She didn't bring medication. No fancy pills, no syringes, no modern treatments. Just herbs. Whispered lullabies. Silent prayers at Henry's bedside, murmured in a language that felt as old as the earth itself. Richard watched her with suspicion, his mind torn between skepticism and hope. He didn't trust her. Not entirely. She was different. Foreign. Unconventional in ways that unsettled him. But what choice did he have? The doctors had given up. His son was slipping away, and every moment was a fight against time. So, he allowed her to stay. To work her magic, as his colleague had called it. And yet, the more he watched her, the more uneasy he became. Mirella never spoke much, never revealed anything about her methods. She would sit by Henry's bed, her fingers moving like they were performing some sacred ritual, and Henry, his fragile body, seemed to respond to her. But how? Why? Richard couldn't answer those questions. All he knew was that Henry seemed different. More peaceful. More relaxed. But not better. Not truly better. A nagging feeling tugged at Richard's gut. It was too much. Too fast. Something was wrong, and he wasn't sure what. And then, as the days passed, it became clear. Richard needed answers. He couldn't just sit back and hope for a miracle. He had to know what was really going on in that room. Before he left on his overseas business trip, he made one last decision. One last move. He installed a hidden camera. He would watch the footage when he returned. He would finally uncover the truth. And when he saw it, he would know. Days turned into weeks. Richard's phone buzzed occasionally with brief, almost clinical updates. Henry ate today. Henry smiled. Henry spoke 2 full sentences. Each message was a small victory. And yet, Richard couldn't shake the disbelief that churned in his gut. He thought Mirella might be exaggerating. After all, how could a boy who had barely spoken a word for months suddenly recover without the aid of modern treatment? The best hospitals, the brightest minds, had failed. So, why would this mysterious gypsy woman make a difference? But the truth was undeniable, Henry was changing. Slowly at first, in small, fragile steps. He began sitting up on his own. Drawing pictures, his small hands holding a crayon with more strength than Richard had seen in weeks. At night, he'd sleep peacefully, something Richard hadn't witnessed in a long time. And through the darkness, he could hear Mirella's voice, soft and soothing, floating through the house like a lullaby from another world. Richard was stuck in boardrooms, buried in meetings, his mind clouded by the pressure of his business empire. But there was an ache, one that seemed to rise in his chest every time he thought of his son. The same boy who had once refused to look him in the eye, who had grown distant and withdrawn, was now opening up. And it wasn't to him. It wasn't to his father. It was to a stranger. A gypsy woman. A woman he had brought into their home with nothing but hope and desperation as his guide. Richard's mind twisted with guilt. He had been absent, too busy, too focused on his own empire. Too blind to see what mattered most. His son. And now, Henry had found something in Mirella, a connection, a warmth, that Richard hadn't been able to offer. His son was beginning to heal, but it wasn't Richard who had brought him back. It was someone else. Someone he couldn't control. The guilt festered. The jealousy grew. But what hurt most was the realization that Henry was responding to her, this stranger, more than he had ever responded to him. But it wasn't just healing he saw when he returned home that evening. No. When Richard opened the footage on his laptop, what he saw shattered every belief he had about healing, about love, about trust. In the quiet of his office, with the lights dimmed low, Richard sat in front of his laptop, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across the room. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he fast-forwarded through the days of footage. He watched Mirella, her delicate hands brushing Henry's hair, feeding him soup, reading stories in that soft, mysterious voice of hers. It all seemed so ordinary. So harmless. But then, something changed. At 3:12 a.m. on the third night, Richard's attention snapped back. The lights in Henry's room flickered. A strange, unsettling glow bathed the room, faint, yet unmistakable. The room seemed to hum with an energy Richard couldn't place. Mirella stood beside Henry's bed, her back to the camera. She was whispering in a language Richard didn't understand, her hands moving slowly over the boy's body, not touching him, but weaving through the air above him. It was almost as though she were performing some kind of ritual. Richard leaned in closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Henry's fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open, then shut again. But then... Suddenly, Henry's back arched violently, and he cried out, not in pain, but with a force and intensity that sent a chill down Richard's spine. It was like something inside the boy had suddenly awakened. Something that had been dormant for so long. Richard froze the frame, his hands trembling. Mirella's eyes were closed. Her expression was calm at first, but then it shifted, becoming strained, like she was fighting against something unseen. Pain. She wasn't healing Henry. No. She was transferring something. Richard's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. Mirella wasn't just helping his son, she was taking something from him. Something invisible, yet real. What had she been doing to Henry? What kind of power was she wielding? And most importantly, what had she been taking from him? The questions flooded his mind, but the answers were too terrifying to confront. Richard's grip on the edge of the desk tightened. He had been wrong. Mirella wasn't just a healer. She was a manipulator. And now, it was time to stop her. Richard had no choice but to act. He had to confront her. And when he did, she would regret ever stepping foot in his house. Confronting her wasn't part of the plan. But Richard could no longer hold it in. The weight of everything, his fear, his confusion, the growing dread in his gut, finally erupted. He stormed into Henry's room, Mirella standing by the bed as always, her quiet presence now unsettling. "What are you doing to my son?" Richard demanded, his voice shaking with anger and panic. Mirella turned slowly to face him. Her eyes, usually so calm, now seemed weary, tired beyond measure. Her lips parted, and she spoke softly, her voice carrying a sadness that Richard had never expected to hear. "Not to him," she said, her words almost a whisper. "For him." Richard's anger faltered for a moment, his mind racing. What did she mean? Mirella took a deep breath, as if preparing to share something painful. Then, in a low voice, she told him the truth. She had lost her younger brother to the same illness that had been slowly taking Henry. The grief of that loss had nearly destroyed her. When she saw Henry, so frail and weak, she couldn't bear the thought of another child suffering the same fate. She couldn't bear to watch another family lose a loved one to something so cruel and inevitable. And so, she made a vow. She wouldn't let it happen again. Through a mix of spiritual healing, ancient Romani rituals, and an inner power passed down from her grandmother, Mirella had found a way to absorb the sickness from Henry. Night after night, she took his illness into herself, bit by bit, piece by piece. Richard stood frozen, his heart racing as he listened to her story. He had thought she was some kind of charlatan, a mere fortune teller with strange methods. But this was something entirely different. Mirella wasn't just helping Henry, she had been sacrificing herself for him. Every time he saw her perform those rituals, it hadn't been magic or trickery. It had been the painful, selfless act of taking Henry's suffering into herself. The pain Richard had seen on her face wasn't just exhaustion. It was the physical toll of carrying Henry's sickness, piece by piece, until it had almost consumed her. He wanted to scream at her, demand answers, question her methods, but instead, he broke down. A man who had hired her out of desperation, a man who had seen only the surface, now stood in front of a woman willing to die for a child not her own. A woman who had risked everything, the very essence of herself, to save a life that wasn't even hers to save. And at that moment, the truth settled deep in Richard's chest. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't fearful. He was humbled. Henry recovered. Fully. It wasn't just a surprise, it was a miracle. The doctors, who had been preparing Richard for the worst, were stunned. They had no explanation, no scientific reason for how his son, once so frail, so near death, could suddenly be restored to health. They called it a miracle, but Richard knew the truth. Even if they didn't, there was something far greater than medicine at work here. The boy who had been barely able to speak, move, or even lift his head, was now running around, playing with friends, his laughter filling the house. Henry was alive, truly alive. His vitality came back as if it had been waiting to be unlocked, and now, there he was, smiling and full of joy. But the most significant change wasn't just in Henry. It was in Richard himself. He could never forget what Mirella had done, what she had sacrificed. She hadn't just been a nurse. She had been an angel in disguise, a woman whose determination and compassion had saved his son in a way no doctor ever could. She had given Henry the life he had now, but in doing so, she had given up something far more precious to her own soul. Mirella had left without saying goodbye. The day after Henry's full recovery, she had quietly packed her things, slipping out of the house as though she hadn't just saved a boy's life. She hadn't taken the money he'd offered, nor had she accepted his thanks. She had simply smiled and said, "Take care of him now. That's your real job." And with those words, she was gone, leaving behind no trace, only the memories of her soft lullabies, her strange yet calming presence, and the incredible love she had shown a child who wasn't even hers. Richard had tried to find her after that. He had searched, asked around, but no one had heard from her. It was as though she had disappeared into thin air, like a shadow fading with the morning light. But there was one thing Richard knew for sure: Mirella had not done this for recognition, for money, or for fame. She had done it out of the goodness of her heart, out of a deep, selfless love for a child who had nothing to give her in return. And for that, she had made the ultimate sacrifice. She had given up her health, her very life force, so that Henry could live. Years passed, as they always do. Time marched on relentlessly, and life changed. But some things remained the same, like the way Henry grew up, thriving in ways Richard had never dared to dream. His son became strong, healthy, and full of life. He was the boy who had once been on the verge of death, and now he was a young man who embodied everything Mirella had given him. Richard was grateful beyond measure, but there was also a deep, aching void inside him. The woman who had made all of this possible was gone, and he could never truly repay her for what she had done. There would never be enough money, enough thanks, or enough recognition to give her the respect and gratitude she truly deserved. But he did something. Something small, yet powerful. Richard knew that Mirella hadn't done this for herself, but for others, so that her legacy could live on in some form. So, he made sure that it did. He funded a healing center in her name, one that would combine the best of modern medicine with the ancient healing practices that Mirella had used on his son. It was a place where people could receive not just medical treatment, but also spiritual healing, a place where the mind, body, and soul were all treated with equal importance. The center became a sanctuary, a place of peace and restoration. It was a place where science met spirituality, where modern technology and ancient traditions coexisted in harmony. Richard made sure of it. He wanted to ensure that Mirella's spirit would live on forever, that her methods, her wisdom, would be passed on to others who needed it. And the center flourished. People came from all over the world to experience the healing she had brought to his son. Henry, now a young man, never forgot her. He could still remember her gentle voice, the way she would sing him to sleep, the way she had made him feel safe and loved, even when he had been at his lowest point. Henry would often think about Mirella, about how her strength had given him his life back, and how her sacrifice had allowed him to grow into the person he was becoming. And every year, on the anniversary of her departure, Henry would do something special. He would sit by the window, just like he used to when he was a boy. He would look out at the world, lost in thought, and as the sun began to set, he would start singing one of the lullabies she had sung to him all those years ago. It was his way of remembering her, of keeping her alive in his heart. The song was simple, but it carried so much meaning. It was a melody of love, hope, and healing, a melody that had saved him when nothing else could. "Sometimes, angels don't wear wings," Henry would say to himself, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "They wear scarves and carry herbs, and teach us how to believe again." It was a truth that had been passed down through the years, a truth that Henry would carry with him for the rest of his life. Mirella hadn't just healed his body, she had healed his soul. And through her, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from medicine, but from the heart. Richard stood beside him, watching as his son sang. And in that moment, he realized that Mirella's legacy had not only saved Henry's life, it had transformed their entire family. It had shown them the power of love, of selflessness, and of believing in something greater than oneself. Mirella had not just given them a miracle, she had given them hope, something they could carry with them for the rest of their lives.